Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join me for this interview with Dr. Kristin Neff. I've long admired Kristin Neff's work around self-compassion, and particularly how self-compassion interfaces with spirituality, which is something that we're going to be talking about toward the end of the interview. So without further ado, let me just introduce Dr. Kristin Neff.
Hi, Mark. Nice to be here. Nice to be with you all.
It's great to be with you too. Welcome. So I'd like to begin with this distinction between self-esteem and self-compassion, which is something that a lot of people just don't understand. You've said that self-esteem can be problematic. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, so self-esteem is really an estimation of worth. It's a judgment or an evaluation. And so we know that psychologically, it's better to have high self-esteem than low self-esteem for mental health. The problem is, how do you get your high self-esteem? So most people get it in a comparative way. In other words, in order to feel good about yourself, you need to feel special and above average. I'm sure if I said, hey, Mark, your podcast, yeah, it's average. You're going to be like, no, if you, same thing, if you say, hey, I read your book, Kristin, it was average. I'm going to be like devastated. So it's not okay to be average, which means we're constantly jockeying for a position to try to kind of feel superior to others in some way. So that's one problem. Another big problem is that it's unstable because it's typically contingent. It depends on success. Like we have high self-esteem when we succeed, we have low self-esteem when we fail. It's contingent on how attractive we think we are, how much we think other people like us. So it can be unstable. And so that's the problem with self-esteem. It's like a fair weather friend. It's there for you sometimes, but it deserts you, especially when you need it most, which is when you fail. And so self-compassion, so I did a postdoc for 2 years with one of the country's leading self-esteem researchers, and psychology had fallen in love with self-esteem, but then there was this big backlash with researchers seeing all these, they call it the dark side of self-esteem. And meanwhile, I was practicing self-compassion in my personal life when I was first learning Buddhism, at the end of the 1990s. And so self-compassion isn't an estimation of worth. It's actually how you relate to yourself when you're suffering. Right? So the word passion means to suffer, com is with. And normally we think of how are we with other people when they're suffering. And so self-compassion is simply how are we with ourselves when we're suffering. Are we kind? Are we warm? Are we supportive? Or are we harsh and judgmental? Are we willing to be with the pain or not? Or do we try to avoid it at all costs? And really importantly, what makes compassion different than pity is there a sense of connectedness there? So if I pity other people, I look down on them. If I feel self-pity, I feel like, whoa, it's me. I'm separate from the rest of the world. Compassion, by definition, includes a sense of connectedness to something larger than ourselves. Right. So those are the major differences.
So when the going gets hard, it's self-compassion that we want. Self-compassion is a foul weather friend.
Yes, it's I call it a true friend, a stable friend, right? So like when you fail or make a mistake, yeah, maybe your self-esteem takes a hit. Sorry. But you can still be there for yourself in a compassionate way. And this is really important because we know that failure is our best teacher, right? Mm-hmm. But if we're lost in shame because we failed, how much are we going to be able to learn? But if we have compassion, we say, hey, it's only human to fail. It happens, kind of support ourselves. And then we think, what can I learn from this situation? How can I grow from this? Then it's just a lot healthier all around.
I'd like to take this opportunity to digress a little bit around shame. This is a word that gets thrown around all the time. But I'd like to know from a clinical perspective, how do you define shame and how do you differentiate shame from guilt?
Right. So guilt is typically remorse when you feel badly about something you've done, especially if it hurts someone else. Guilt can actually be a kind of healthy thing. If you don't have any guilt for hurting someone, well, then there's a problem, right? Mm-hmm. So guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. With shame, we personalize, we kind of identify with our behaviors or other people's reactions to us in a way that it's a global judgment of self-worth. Shame is really a problem because it's so hard for us to feel shame. And by the way, it's an evolutionary emotion. So human beings, unless you're a psychopath, now have a natural sense of shame where we feel worried about the group judging us and excluding us. And of course, in the past, if you did something to really break group norms, you'd be kicked out and you die. So that's why people develop this sense of shame. So it's not bad in and of itself. The problem is that we take shame really seriously. We have a moment of shame, but then when we identify with it and get lost in a storyline, like I'm unlovable, everyone hates me, I'm worthless. And then we can't bear feeling that. So we often like hide those feelings away. They're often underneath things like addiction or sometimes other sorts of destructive behaviors. Whenever you have something really sticky, like some psychological issue that you can't really work through, it's often because there's a layer of shame hidden underneath it.
Got it. Okay, so moving back to self-compassion, what are the elements of self-compassion? I know you've mentioned 3 of primary, but could you break those down?
Yeah, so each kind of has its opposite as well. So the first element of self-compassion, as I define it, actually is mindfulness. So I learned about self-compassion when I was learning Buddhism from a Thich Nhat Hanh Sangha. And Thich Nhat Hanh always talked a lot about self-compassion, I think even more explicitly than a lot of other teachers. And so you have to be mindful in the sense that you have to be willing to be with, acknowledge, and kind of, be present with your own pain in order to give yourself compassion, as opposed to what I call over-identifying with it. So we actually usually do one of 2 things when difficult emotions arise. Either we ignore it. It's like, if a friend called you and you didn't pick up their call, you couldn't give your friend compassion. Well, sometimes we don't pick up our own phone call. We're hurting, we're feeling badly about something, and we don't even just go there. It's just too much. Or what we do is the opposite. We can identify with it. In other words, our awareness gets really locked into the thoughts about what's happening. And then we kind of start to exaggerate things. Not only did I make a mistake, I am like the biggest screw up in the history of the world, that type of thing. Right. So we need to be able to have the balance of mindfulness. It's just like, oh, wow, that hurts. I really made a mistake. Okay, painful, but it doesn't mean that, again, that I am a mistake. So that's the first element.
And there's a sense of proportion in that.
There's a sense of balance. Yeah, proportion, balance. We don't catastrophize. Neither do we, avoid or overly minimize. And then an additional component, this is the one people think of most kind of readily when they think of compassion, is the warm quality of the response. Right. So sometimes sometimes people who have a mindfulness practice, they may be aware, okay, I just had a difficult thought or feeling, but all they kind of do is give space to it. And maybe they don't identify. And that's really great. But what you do when you bring in the warmth is it makes things, it actually changes things physiologically, and it helps us feel safe. So in other words, when we're hurting, we have a sense of, oh, I'm sorry, or how could I help? Or the sense of just care. And it actually is linked to our physiology. It's linked to the parasympathetic nervous system. As mammals, we're designed to feel safe and secure when our parents or the caregivers show us this warmth and care. And so when we give ourselves this warmth and care, we also help ourselves feel safe in a very helpful way.
As opposed to I hear you without offering any affect, the way some therapists work, in that's very tabula rasa kind of way.
Right. Yeah. They might just give empathy. I had a friend that would always like parrot back what I said. He would give me empathy. And I'm like, don't give me that empathy. I want compassion. I want you to say, oh, I'm so sorry, Kristin. That must have been so painful for you.
Right.
So, yeah. So you might say that the mindfulness is the space. The compassion is the warmth, the care. And by the way, the opposite of this is self-judgment. Now, often, especially when our suffering is caused by something we think we did. But even sometimes, we just give ourselves a cold shoulder, like just grit and bear it. And so it's opposed to being judgmental or harsh or cold with ourselves. We're warm, we're kind, we're caring toward ourselves. And then the third element, which is really important, and I think this is what differentiates, maybe people talk about self-love. Why don't you use the term self-love, Kristin? Well, a narcissist may love themselves, whether or not they truly do, I don't know, but they're, certainly they may be really pleased with themselves. So like compassion, again, kind of what I mentioned before, the difference between compassion and pity is a sense of interconnectedness. If I pity you, Mark, I'm feeling sorry for you. There's a sense of separation. If I have compassion, it's like, hey, I've been there, Mark. I've experienced something similarly. Well, self-compassion, we do the same thing with ourselves. We frame our experience in light of, now, I call it the shared human experience. And normally when I talk about it, I just speak of it in these terms. But since I'm on this show, I really wanted to call it interbeing. So Thich Nhat Hanh's understanding of, and in Buddhism in general, often our judgment comes from thinking we did it, we're in control. So understanding the interplay of causes and conditions, that nothing is totally separate from each other. And ultimately, we're kind of all part of this one big beingness or one big awareness. That's really a part of self-compassion as well, a sense of connectedness to something larger than ourselves. You can just think of it as other humans if you want, or you can think of it as the universe if you want, but just going beyond the kind of the sense of separation.
And that's what distinguishes self-compassion from self-cherishing, or a feeling of holding ourselves special or entitled in some way. Like, why would this be happening to me?
Right. Or narcissism. But even just self-love. I mean, self-love is wonderful. I mean, it can be not narcissistic self-love. Maybe you're just feeling the love, you're feeling the warmth, you're feeling the space. But if there's a sense of separation, your experience is still going to be different than if you realize that you aren't alone, that what you're experiencing is due to things that are bigger than yourself. It's a really, I think, from my point of view, these three elements are essential.
Yes. Also, and we'll get into this later in the interview, but when in the question of self-love, what we need to ask ourselves is, what are we loving? Who are we loving, or what are we loving? But I want to get into know self later.
Okay. All right. Good.
For now, just let me know, what are the commonest misunderstandings and obstacles to self-compassion in your experience?
So it's funny. It's like clockwork. Every culture we've looked at, the same misgivings come up. It almost makes me wonder if they're biological in nature, although I can't really think of a mechanism for it. But the same ones come up. People think it's weak. They think of compassion just as kind of being soft and squishy. I suspect it's partly due to gender roles, because compassion traditionally is in the female domain, and it's kind of seen, females are seen as weaker. I mean, I don't know, but the idea that it's weak. The research shows it's exactly the opposite, right? If we have our own back, if we're warm, supportive, and feel interconnected and present when we're going through a difficult time, we're much more likely to get through the difficulty than if we're cold to ourselves, if we're, just shaming ourselves or slamming ourselves. It's kind of obvious, but people don't recognize that. Another one is that it's selfish. Partly because our culture says, oh, you should always be thinking of other people. People say, oh, if you want to be happy, then don't think about yourself so much. And I kind of, that message makes me uncomfortable, because it's like a zero-sum game. Yeah. People assume you have to either be thinking of yourself or others. Like, we have only 5 units of compassion. So you better, you give you 3 to yourself, you're only going to have 2 left over. It's completely misunderstanding how it works. The more our heart is open, the more we're in touch with compassion, the more resources we have available to give other people. And so one research finding that really supports that is the literature on self-compassion and burnout. So if you're a caregiver, whether a professional or family caregiver, and you're really compassionate to others, and you're just cold or, mean to yourself, you are going to burn out. And so self-compassion is what allows us to have the resources to care for others. So that's one. Another big one is it just means letting yourself off the hook. I remember when the first big New York Times article came out about my research, the title was "Give Yourself a Break." And I thought, because people, I think it's like, just going easy on yourself, give yourself a break. Well, sometimes that's a compassionate thing to do. Sometimes the most healthy thing you can do is to go a little easier on yourself. But people misinterpret that to mean going easy on yourself, even when the healthier thing to do would be to like kick yourself in the butt and say, hey, you got to do something. So self-compassion is all about the alleviation of suffering. And that's another way of defining what compassion is, concern with the alleviation of suffering. And so what we know from the literature is people who are more self-compassionate, they don't always go easy on themselves. They're more likely to like exercise, go to the doctor, take care of themselves, do the difficult stuff because they care. But the number one by far block to self-compassion, there's people who've done research on this, the biggest barrier is the belief that we need to be hard on ourselves to motivate change. Right? We really think, it used to be spare the rod, spoil the child. It used to be absolutely accepted parenting philosophy that you needed to be harsh, use corporal punishment with children in order for them to be motivated to reach their full potential. And luckily, most of us have like gone past that. And now we realize that giving support, encouragement to children is actually much more effective. So they feel securely attached and you give them the resources they need to achieve. But we haven't gotten that message with ourselves for whatever reason. But the research shows without a doubt that self-compassion is a more effective motivator. Now, again, remember, self-compassion does not mean pretending there's a problem when there is. Right. So if you're
pretending there's not a problem, pretending there's not a problem.
Pretending there's right. Sorry, I misspoke. Yeah. Doesn't mean that you're pretending there's not a problem when there is. That's why the mindfulness is so important. If we're messing up, it's not kind to not see that. Kindness says, wow, okay, that you really messed that up. Well, okay, it happens. It doesn't mean that you're flawed or, fatally flawed. It just means you made a mistake. Right. So I'll give you an example of some of the research that shows why this isn't true. We taught NCAA athletes self-compassion. By the way, we didn't call it self-compassion. We called it inner strength training because the culture of athletics is like so, we didn't think they'd respond to self-compassion. So we called it inner strength training. And we taught them when they had setbacks in their training routines or in games to give themselves compassion. And especially for athletes, the most compassionate thing you can do is to give accurate, clear, and productive feedback, in terms of what they did wrong, but also how they can improve it. That's compassion for anyone, but especially for an athlete. And what we found is when they were like a good supportive coach who was very clear, but constructive, like constructive criticism, their performance actually improved.
Of course.
So those are the biggest ones. There's a few others, but those are the most common ones.
So let me flip that question on its head a little bit. There's so much self-loathing in our culture. I'm sure you know the story about the Dalai Lama and the scientists who, he didn't understand what they were talking about.
Yeah. Either way, I think that's because he's the Dalai Lama. I gotta say that. So I know people who are there with him. Maybe, among Tibetan monks, but among Tibetans in general, that's not true.
Is that right?
Asian cultures they're very hard on themselves, especially East Asian cultures. But so you gotta, if you grew up in a monastery among Buddhist monks, maybe you don't understand it, but it's not an East-West thing. We have research that shows that actually most people are kinder to others than themselves. And I'm just going to add one more thing. There's actually a physiological reason for this, and we do know this through research. It's because when we fail or make a mistake or something really threatening happens, we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. The threat defense response gets triggered. We have sympathetic nervous system reactivity. And so, so we fight ourselves, hoping that we'll control ourselves to keep ourselves safe, or maybe we'll beat others to the punch, or, to kind of prevent it hurting so bad if they beat us up, or we flee into a sense of shame and isolation, or we freeze and we get stuck. The care response actually evolved for other people, right? So between family members and also for in-group members, unfortunately not for out-group members. I wish I could say that was true, but for in-group members, for close others, people who we identify with, and family members, it's natural for us to care. And that you can see our ancestors who cared for their offspring and group members, they pass their genes on. But it actually involved more for other people. So we do have to kind of do a little hack to have compassion for ourselves. We have to use the system. And we do physiologically. When you give yourself compassion, for instance, you have increased heart rate variability and heart coherence, which is associated with parasympathetic response.
Mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm. So these may be connected. I was going to ask you about the epidemic of narcissism that you've talked about. And that seems to be connected to the reason there is so much self-loathing. And we're so hard on ourselves. Do you see
yeah.
a connection there? I hope you're enjoying this conversation from the Seekers Forum. If you'd like to hear the rest of this interview and learn more about our robust collection of talks, videos, and guided writing sessions, please join us at theseekersforum.com and sign up for our free 30-day trial membership. I hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.